We've all got a big decision to make about who leads the country for the next 5 years, about who has power and influence in Westminster. You get the opportunity to have your say in the election on July the 4th. Over the past 2 weeks, we've heard from the leaders of most of the major parties. Tonight, it's the turn of the co-leader of the Greens, Adrian Ramsay. Adrian Ramsay, welcome. I'm going to make the same promise to you that I've made to all the leaders who've sat in that chair, which is everything you say over the next half hour or so will be broadcast in full. I want you to have the chance to make your points, but I hope you'll answer the questions that are about topics that people have told the BBC they care about, and you've not had any advance warning of what those questions are. Let's start with a general question about the Greens.
Yes.
Who the Green Party really is. Now, obviously, you're a party that wants to save the planet, and we're going to come to that very soon. But sometimes you look like a party who wants to save the countryside and get us all recycling, and other times it looks like you want to tax the rich and march against the war in Gaza. Who are the Greens?
Well, the Green Party is a party that wants to think about what really matters in life. How do we measure success for society? And for me, that's about having a society which is more equal and where people can access the public services that they need. The big issue that people raise with me on the doorstep in East Anglia and across the country is that our NHS is severely overstretched. People can't get access to a doctor or NHS dentist when they need one. We need to tackle the scandal of sewage in our rivers. We need to protect our natural environment. And we need to rethink how we run society so that we are supporting people who are the worst off, who have really suffered under the cost of living crisis, as we all have done. And we need to invest in that transition to a green economy with all the benefits that that will bring, both for tackling the cost of living crisis and for addressing the biggest issue of our time in the climate emergency.
Well, let's start with that, because that's what most people will associate you with, that transition to net zero. Philosophical question. In order to have gain for the planet, do we all have to share a little bit of pain?
Well, quite the opposite, Nick, because we're suffering pain at the moment, aren't we? That we have extortionate train fares in the UK, far higher than other countries. So if we were to invest in our rail network, we could be bringing down the cost of people's train journeys and making the greener option the cheaper and greener option. Same with our food supply, that the shocks we've seen in the economy, in international fares, have exposed the fact that we're too reliant on international imports for our food. And if we were to support our farmers to produce far more of our food locally, as farmers want to do, the farmers I speak to in Suffolk and around the country say, we want to produce more food locally, we want to do it in a nature-friendly way, and we're proposing to put the money into that. So whether it's about energy, where renewable energy is the cheapest energy to produce, if we put that money in, whether it's about insulating people's homes to bring those bills down.
That's interesting.
It's really about helping tackle the cost, the root causes of the cost of living crisis.
That is an interesting claim, that there's no pain. Let's go to your manifesto. Here it is, Real Hope, Real Change. It says, the Green Party manifesto. And let's turn to one of the things it says. It says in there that what you want to do is scrap every petrol and diesel car, every single one, in the country within a decade. How many cars is that? Do you know?
Well, what we're looking at there, Nick, is how we transition to a green economy, and every party
Do you know how many cars it would involve scrapping?
Well, clearly it would be tens of millions, wouldn't it?
It's about 30 million cars that you'll be scrapping. Is your message to people here, if you've just spent 10, 15,000 on a new petrol or diesel car, and you might feel that you have to because of where you live, that's it. It goes. The Greens are going to take your car away.
No, that's not our message at all. And in fact, it would be 2035 before we were looking at getting to that point. And in the meantime, the popularity of electric vehicles is growing, and that needs more investment and support to bring the price down. And indeed, if we say from 2027 that new cars need to be electric cars, then that means there's going to be lots of second-hand petrol and diesel cars for some time.
Yeah, but there's still people who've just bought a car, and the message is not that long in the life of a car. That's where they're going to end up, on the scrap heap, because you're saying, unlike all the other parties, they've all got to go.
Well, from 2035, and actually other parties were saying that until recently, but we want to give the sector, in this case the electric vehicle sector, but it could equally be about renewable heat, it could be about renewable energy. We want to give those green sectors confidence. And what the government has done in recent months is to pull the rug away from underneath those sectors when we have huge economic opportunities here.
But you're going to have to pay, aren't you, to do this? We have so-called scrappage schemes. We asked the AA.
Yes.
We showed them your policy. And we said to the AA, what do you think that would cost? And they said if you have the current incentives to buy electric vehicles for 30 million cars that you want to scrap, they put the cost at £86 billion. That is a lot more than the cost of all the schools in England. They describe the policy as an impossible dream.
Well, we do need to put money behind supporting people with that green transition in all sorts of ways. And we've showed in our manifesto exactly how we would fund that green transition. And we need to think about the economic benefits of doing so. Huge job creation opportunities, whether that's in renewable energy, which is the cheapest way to produce electricity and can bring our bills down, whether it's in public transport, because a transition like this can only be done and should only be done if we at the same time put the investment into, for example, our rail network, which is one of the most expensive in Europe.
But I'm asking whether it's possible and whether it's affordable. Let me ask you about another ambition that's contained in this manifesto. And to be fair, the UK Climate Change Committee, which advises all government, talks about it, the need for us to eat less meat in our diet, cutting the amount, they say, by a fifth in a decade, by a third by 2050. Now, what that means to most people watching this programme is in here. 2.5 billion of these burgers are eaten every year in the UK. Are you saying that to save the climate, we've got to ban the burger, or we've got to make burgers a heck of a lot more expensive?
No, neither of those proposals are in our manifesto. What is in our manifesto is supporting our farmers to produce far more food
but
within
I'm not
the
asking
UK.
just what you put in an election sales document. I'm arguing that the Greens have always argued for eating less meat. So in the end, would it have to be more expensive?
As I say, that's not a policy that's in our manifesto. And our manifesto is about what we want to put forward for this next 5 years.
I'm sorry, Mr. Ramsay, that's misleading. Your manifesto talks about a carbon tax. And a carbon tax is a tax on everything that produces carbon dioxide, which could heat the planet. And one of the main sources are cows. And therefore, the argument is you have to tax. It's a Green Party policy. It says we want a progressive transition from a diet dominated by meat to one with a higher proportion of plant-based foods, by public education and the operation of the carbon tax. It costs money.
So our carbon tax that we're proposing for this 5 years in this manifesto doesn't include farming, and that's because we're putting positive incentives to support farmers to transition to support producing more food locally, more nature-friendly farming. That's what farmers in the NFU and local farmers that I speak to in Suffolk tell me all the time. More and more people are choosing to have a greater proportion of plant-based food in their diet. That's something that's happening anyway. But we're talking about how we can make the farming system overall more resilient. And one of the big points there is about what proportion of our food is actually produced in the UK.
Sure, but it's also about price, isn't it? That's what a carbon tax is. It would be a tax on meat. It would be a tax on cars. It would be a tax on every delivery to your house. It would be a tax on many of the things that we buy and consume. And you say you could raise £90 billion in tax from a carbon tax. And the think tank, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, they say it would be impossible to raise that sort of money without the effect being felt by, and this is the key phrase, felt by everyone. Everyone would pay more for something as a result of the carbon tax.
So what we're proposing in the carbon tax is a tax that hits the big polluting companies that are causing the climate emergency, that has a huge impact on people on poorer incomes. So a tax, for example, on high polluting imports of goods that undermine British manufacturing. We want to support low carbon British manufacturing. We also want to have a carbon tax on those big polluting companies. And actually ordinary people are suffering from the fact that this government is not acting on these issues. We have escalating energy bills, escalating food bills, extortionate train prices.
But you're not pretending that the IFS are wrong.
Let me be clear, if the Green Party policies were implemented, we would be able to produce cheaper electricity because renewable energy is the best way to do that.
Forgive me interrupting, but here's the problem, Mr. Ramsay. You're saying to people, no pain. These guys who monitor public spending say massive pain for everybody, potentially. Or you've got to compensate them all so that we get more money back.
Let me quote back
to you. Which will cost a fortune.
Let me quote back to you one of the things that the IFS has said today. They've said that introducing a carbon tax for example, relating to energy, wouldn't work unless you were also insulating people's homes. And that's one of the main things that we're proactively saying, that we need to, first of all, put in place the measures that help people reduce their bills. So we're proposing a nationwide programme to insulate people's homes, which can bring bills down, keep homes warm. This is about supporting ordinary people by actually tackling the things that are pushing up the cost of living. Because if we live in a resilient, more resilient way, well,
forgive me, let's go to the cost.
Can I just be clear? Nick, time and time again, experts, economists, climate scientists warn us that the costs of not tackling the climate crisis are far greater than the costs of tackling, and that's the costs to the exchequer, to the government, and the cost to individuals, because people are forking out for their energy bills because we have the leakiest homes in Europe. The energy is going out of their doors and windows because we haven't insulated
everybody
people's
can have
homes.
warmer homes, everybody can stop eating meat, and it doesn't cost us any money. Let's talk about the cost. Now, you do in your manifesto say that the total cost would be £145 billion a year on day-to-day spending, the total cost of all the things you want to do, which is a vast sum of money. Now, these numbers are baffling to people, billions of numbers. So forgive me giving you an illustration and giving people at home. This is what the Labour Party say they would spend. Each Lego brick is £1 billion. They say they'd spend £5 billion. This is what the Conservatives say they'd spend on tax cuts. Some people disagree with these numbers, but this is what they say they'd spend. That's £17 billion. This is what the Greens Party say they'll spend. It's an absolute fortune that you're promising to spend. Way more than Jeremy Corbyn promised to spend. Way more than Liz Truss did in tax cuts. And you're asking people to believe that they can spend all of that money, £145 billion, without consequence?
You're right, Nick, to highlight the difference. Why is there such a difference? Because we have an NHS at breaking point that requires substantial investment, and the Nuffield Trust has been clear that the Labour and Conservative proposals that you've outlined here would leave the NHS worse off than it was under David Cameron's austerity. We need the transition to the green economy in a way that tackles the cost of living crisis, as I've talked about. We need to invest in our schools that are crumbling and where teachers don't have the money to spend on the things they need to provide our children with a good education. And let's look at this in context, because the GDP to tax ratio that the Green Party is proposing would take us closer to where the average European country is. We're right at the bottom of the...
Just to translate that for people who don't use GDP to tax. What we're talking about is the share of the economy that's taken up by tax. And let's talk about tax.
Let me finish that point.
Yeah.
So the share of the economy that goes into tax for the UK at the moment is near the bottom of the European league table. What we're proposing would move us up, but we would still be below where France and other countries are. Well, and so actually it's Labour and the Conservatives that are way out of step with what other countries are doing. The IFS, Institute for Fiscal Studies, has been very clear that the next government is either going to have to cut public services or increase taxes. And so the Green Party is the only party being honest in this election that says that actually by European standards we can make fairly modest changes to the tax system, asking those with the broadest shoulders to pay modestly more. But what would we get from that? Because at the moment, people
let me ask you about the policy
you've
just mentioned.
What it would bring?
Yes. When I ask you a question, if I may, which is, you've said you want to hit the people with the broadest shoulders. And in particular, for people who haven't read the manifesto, there's a proposal for more tax on the rich, 50 to 70 billion, you say you could raise from taxes on the rich. In particular, a wealth tax.
That's right.
Can you name a country that has raised anything like the sorts of sums that you say you could raise from a wealth tax?
So there are other European countries that have introduced wealth taxes.
That wasn't the question. The question was, has anybody raised anything like that money?
We've been working closely with academics and experts around a range of models for how a wealth tax could work, and we've been fairly cautious in the model and in the assumptions that we've chosen around that. And on the day that our manifesto was produced,
allow me, cautious, that would suggest there is a country that has ever raised anything like the sort of money you're saying for the wealth tax. But the answer is there isn't, is there? 12 European countries introduced wealth tax. 9 of them, including France, got rid of their wealth tax. 3, Norway, Switzerland and Spain, still have them. They raise a fraction of what you're saying you could raise.
Well, there was a particular problem with the way France introduced it, which is that it set the starting point too low. We're proposing a wealth tax starting at 10 million. So if someone has 10 million in wealth and assets, we'd ask them to pay 1%, just 1% of that wealth and assets back into society. And this is about what sort of society do we want to have, Nick? Do we want to have a society where we ask the very richest to pay a little bit more so that we can tackle the fact that our hospitals are severely overstretched?
Providing you could raise the money. The reason I ask you the questions about other countries, it's all very well plucking big numbers out the air, saying that you could raise them, but if no other countries ever manage to do so, and if people who are very wealthy here think we'll leave Britain to go somewhere where there isn't a wealth tax, all of this spending, all of that, you haven't paid for.
Nick, let me look at what external experts have said about the Green Party manifesto. So Aaron Advani, a University of Warwick professor, was quoted by the BBC the day our manifesto came out. One of the first BBC comments on the manifesto was that it's economically credible. And that's because we're putting forward a set of proposals which, yes, are very different to Labour and the Conservatives, because there's a conspiracy of silence, to use the words of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, between those two parties in not being willing to be honest about the investment that's going to be needed if we're to support our NHS and social care, if we're to tackle the scandal of sewage in our rivers, if we're to transition to a green economy and ensure that people can actually bring down the costs that they're facing. And
you've quoted experts, Mr. Ramsay. It is important because you've quoted the Institute of Fiscal Studies. The conclusion they came to today was that you had radical ideas which can realistically make a difference, they said. And they compared you with Nigel Farage's Reform Party. And they said, these ideas are, and I quote, wholly unattainable and help to poison the entire political debate. You're promising things that can't be delivered.
Well, and I've quoted to you what other experts have said, welcoming our proposals, other economists, financial experts who've said the Green Party is bringing in a different way of thinking that by European standards is actually fairly normal. And we can't expect to have the level of health services, the quality of education system that other countries have if we don't put the investment in that's needed. And I think people are looking for a choice in this election.
I want to give you the chance to talk about how the Green Party might use power. You've currently got one MP. You've been clear you're hoping for 4. There are Greens who've been in government or supporting governments right across Europe. In Scotland, where there's a different voting system, makes it easier for you to get elected. It's a system that might one day be introduced for the UK as a whole. Greens have been in government or supporting government. So I want to get a sense of what you might do beyond these big questions of climate and tax and spend. Now, the Greens in Scotland are a separate party, but they launched a controversial fight to change the law so that men could declare themselves to be women without involving a doctor, so-called gender ID. I simply want to ask you whether you've learned from the row. Have you learned from the decision to send a rapist called Adam to a woman's prison after he changed his name and changed his gender and asked to be called Isla? Have you learned from that?
Well, as you say, the Scottish Greens are a separate party to the Green Party of England and Wales, and there's lots of things the Scottish Greens have achieved in government, whether that's on record investment in renewable energy, on reducing child poverty through the Scottish Child Pavement, whether it's on improving public transport and making buses free for under 22s. All those things that the Scottish Greens have achieved in government, I'm very proud of. Now, this issue that you talk about on gender recognition and some of the knock-on impacts of that, that's something that was supported by all 5 parties in the Scottish Parliament.
Sure. Forgive me, having made the point of the positives, what's the answer to the question? Well, have you learned about a male rapist called Adam going to a woman's prison when he said he was called Isla and was a woman? Have you learnt anything? Or are you still saying, J.K. Rowling is wrong? We need to push ahead on gender self-ID. And if we have power in Westminster, that's what we'll argue for.
Well, let me make 2 points on this, Nick. First of all, to answer your question specifically, yes, I think there has to be learning for all of society on the way these changes are made, and ensuring that all spaces, whether they be prisons or any other public spaces, are run in a way that is safe for everybody involved, preserves people's dignity, is absolutely paramount. And the government has been clear, male-bodied people should not be put in female prisons, and personally I would support that. And my second point I'd make is that this whole discussion, as so many people have said, has become highly toxic in a way that ignores the fact that we have very high levels of violence against women and girls. We have a gender pay gap in this country. We have growing rates of hate crime against trans people.
Those are separate subjects.
But my point is we need to have this discussion in a way that's calm and evidence-based and doesn't just seek headlines.
Let me ask you another question, which is equally controversial, the whole issue of migration. Nigel Farage thinks it should be called the immigration election. The Green Party says its long-term aim is for a world without borders. No borders, no immigration control, anyone can live wherever they like. How would a world without borders work?
So that's not our policy in our manifesto that you were quoting earlier on.
Is your policy on your website?
Well, I'm here to defend and promote our policy for the next 5 years of what Green Party MPs will push for in Parliament. What I believe is that we need to uphold the UK's long track record of being a safe haven for people who are fleeing war and persecution or poverty or changes in the climate. And amongst other countries, we need to play our role internationally in welcoming people who are fleeing persecution, and that needs to ensure that there are safe and legal routes.
Mr. Ramsay, is a world without borders as a long-term aim, and I'm asking you, what does it mean? How would it work? Anybody can move here?
Well, as I say, that's not our policy in this manifesto.
But it is your policy as passed by the Green Party.
The reason for that is that at the moment there are growing numbers of people who are risking their lives fleeing their country because of war or persecution or poverty or climate change. And we need to address the root causes of that. That's got to be the starting point. So that's why the Green Party is alone in this election in saying that we would restore the international aid budget that the Conservatives controversially cut to tackle growing inequality around the world. We'd put the investment into climate finance that supports poorer countries to adapt to the changes in the climate.
Okay,
we need to look at why people are fleeing their homes.
If that works and you say, we're dealing with the problems of how people leave their homes, we're going to deal with the climate crisis, we're going to deal with wealth inequality by international aid, then the Green Party policy, I repeat, policy, doesn't matter whether you put it in the manifesto, it's policy, it's on your website, is a world without borders in the long term, isn't it?
Well, our manifesto is about what Green MPs will push for in this next Parliament, and we've got to be pushing the new government to be bolder on all sorts of issues.
Yeah,
on this issue,
many people think you become a party of the radical far left.
There need to be safe and legal routes to asylum for people who are fleeing war and persecution. And we need to work internationally to play our role in supporting people and being welcoming where that's needed.
I'm hearing you, but I'm also hearing you say that you clearly don't agree with your own party's policy. You just think the manifesto is better. There's another thing you should push for, and all these things matter because if you have power in Westminster, you may have power to deliver these policies. Your manifesto says you want to create a legally regulated market for drugs. To be clear, does that mean legalising all drugs and then regulating them so that people going to music festivals this summer are getting the message, vote Green, and you will be allowed to take cocaine, cannabis, ketamine?
So let us look at why we have this policy.
Let's answer the question, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, let's look at what the policy in our manifesto says. It says that we would introduce an independent commission on drugs to address the fact that the war on drugs has failed. We have growing numbers of people who are addicted to drugs, often harmful substances. We have a huge amount of power in the hands of criminal gangs that are profiting from that. And we need to see drug addiction as a medical issue, not as a criminal issue, to support individuals who are addicted, to regulate those drugs, which, as I say, are in the hands of criminal gangs. And let's look through this independent commission at how other countries around the world have introduced more enlightened policies that do actually support people who are addicted.
Sure. And lots of people have argued that. House of Commons Select Committees looked at deregulating drugs. But I'm asking you a specific question. Beyond the addicts, who you might manage to treat as a medical problem rather than a criminal problem, your policy is still legalised drugs. Your co-leader, Carla Denyer, said we want to see a legalised, regulated system for drugs. So I'm asking you to explain what would that mean for someone who's not an addict but says, I want to take some cocaine tonight. I'd like to smoke some cannabis. I'd like to take some ketamine to a music festival. Are they legal or are they illegal?
Well, that will depend on what the independent commission that we want to set up establishes, because it's got to be an evidence-based decision that is made. We are making the point that
but they could be legal.
For so-called softer drugs, that the police spending lots of time pursuing individuals for possession is not necessarily the best use of police time compared to all the work that the criminal gangs profit from that situation. So there needs to be an evidence-based approach on this issue.
Now, I suggested to you a moment ago, but I didn't really give you the chance to answer. I will in a second, that some people look at some of these policies and think you're a party of the radical far left. Let us come to that, though. you, like all parties, have had some problems with your candidates. And everyone who sits in that chair tells me the same thing. Nigel Farage did a couple of days ago. Well, we can't supervise all the candidates. The election was called in a rush and there's going to be an independent inquiry. You did, in the Greens, drop a candidate who tweeted his hunch that Israel had paid Hamas to carry out the atrocities on October the 7th. You still have candidates on ballot papers next to the words "the Green Party." One liked a tweet that said Israel must be eliminated. Another likened Israel's supporters to Nazis. Another claimed the victims of the Holocaust had turned into the predators. And finally, one likened Hamas to the resistance in France in the Second World War. Why are these people all attracted to join and stand for the Green Party?
Well, first of all, Nick, none of those comments you've quoted are ones that I would make or in any way condone. And as you say, the Green Party has had situations where there were candidates who were originally selected. Questions have been made about comments that they have made themselves or they've liked on social media. And in 4 cases, the party has taken action which has resulted in those candidates no longer going forward.
My question was, why are they attracted to your party?
Well, I'm not going to get into talking about individual candidates because if there are questions raised about candidates, then there is a process for them to be investigated, and there may well still be current investigations ongoing, which is independent from the party leadership.
Forgive me, we're almost out of time, but let me give you the chance then to address the point that I made to you. There are people who agree with what you say about the climate. They worry about the countryside. They see the vast amount of money you want to spend. They hear your attitude to drugs and to migration. They see the candidates and they say, the Greens have become, have they not, the new party of the radical far left.
Nick, the people I speak to in East Anglia every day, many of whom have traditionally voted Conservative and feel utterly let down by this government, make very clear that they're looking for a change, for a positive alternative. They're thinking about what the future will be like for their children and grandchildren. And they know that having green voices in Parliament to stand up for the environment, press for the restoration of public services, will push the new government to be bolder. And they're planning to vote for a positive change and for more Green MPs in that next Parliament.
Adrian Ramsay, co-leader of the Green Party in England and Wales, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Next up, on Friday night, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.